So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Siddharth. He's from Sai University in Chennai, and he's going to give us a lecture on the universe as aṁśa of Brahman towards a Vishishtadvaita existence, cosmopsychism. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Flood, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. All right. I take cosmopsychism to be, I define it quite generally to be the view that cosmos or all reality considered together is a single entity that possesses mentality of some sort, some kind of psyche. Usually that's consciousness or phenomenal consciousness of some kind. And that all other entities, physical, mental, otherwise, derive from the one, the cosmic cosmos, which has mentality. Examples of cosmopsychist views include various Vedantic schools, Advaita and Vishishtadvaita specifically that I'll be looking at, and contemporary analytic cosmopsychism. Perhaps some views that are more commonly classified as idealism might also qualify as cosmopsychism on the way I've defined it. I'm okay with that. All right. All cosmopsychist views face the one many problem or the task of explaining the relation between the the cosmos considered as one, and the many other entities. Specifically, the problem is sort of especially problematic when we think of individual cells. And this question is a central point of debate in the various Vedantic schools as well as in contemporary analytic cosmopsychism. And the context in which I'm really exploring this is in the context of renewed interest in panpsychism, as Professor Anand Vaidya was also saying. And there's a lot of interest in comparative studies between contemporary panpsychism and Indian philosophical schools. Most of these studies have looked at classical Advaita. A few others have focused on modern realistic versions of Advaita or the neo Vedantins, specifically Vivekananda or Aurobindo. There is some work which looks at Buddhism in relation to contemporary panpsychism. But however, there is, Advaita's foremost opponents within the Vedantic umbrella, the Vishishtadvaitins, the most famous proponent of which is Ramanuja, has received very little attention in this regard. Perhaps the two papers by Anand Vaidya are the only literature that really look at Vishishtadvaita in comparison to contemporary panpsychism. Vasishtadvaitins, unlike the Advaitins, are realists, as in they claim that all sentient and non-sentient, that is Chit and Achit entities are real attributes of Brahman, as opposed to Advaita, which claims that they are all illusory and not ultimately real. Unlike some of the other Vedantic schools, while they accept the testimony of scriptures as a valid mean of knowledge, they also contend that perception ought to be prioritized over scriptures when the two are in conflict. I mention this only to say that this brings it, makes it easier in some sense to bring it in dialogue with contemporary analytic panpsychism. Right? So in this talk, I propose to contextualize Vishishtadvaita in the context of contemporary cosmopsychism and see how a Vasishtadvaitin might respond to the one many problem, both the one many problem that they anyway face in the Vedantic context, as well as the one many problem that contemporary cosmopsychists face. Right? So that's my aim. When I talk of Vasishtadvaita, I'll be specifically focusing on the views of Sri Ramanuja, who is the foremost proponent, though not the founder, and Venkatanatha, or who's more popularly called Vedanta Desikan, who came around 250 years after Ramanuja and is perhaps the most prolific commentator of Ramanuja's work itself. The outline of my talk will be as follows. I'll briefly outline the one many problem faced by analytic cosmopsychism, or what is often called the subject decombination problem, and the specific kind of the one many problem that Vishishtadvaitins themselves faced. Following this, I shall delineate metaphysics of subjectivity, because as we will see, the one many problem really pertains to the individuation of subjects Following this, I'll move to the metaphysics of relations in Vishishtadvaita, which is really central to how they explain the relationship between Brahman and the individual cells or Jiva. I mean, that is grounded in a specific metaphysics of relations. And especially, I shall focus on Venkatanatha's explication of what attributes, his version of attributes called Visheshana, and what's really special about them. Following that, I shall outline the emergent existence cosmocycist view. All right. Panpsychism in general is the view that all physical entities possess psyche or mind-like properties of some sort. And the most popular version of panpsychism itself is micropsychism, the view that the fundamental physical entities possess mentality of some sort from which the rest of reality and their mentality, including human mentality, sort of emerge. On the other hand, cosmopsychism is the view that is also one kind of panpsychism, but it sort of inverts the flow of existential flow from the whole being the fundamental onto the macro and the micro levels. Both these views of panpsychism face the issue of the combination and the decombination problem, which really is, for example, the micropsychist, the problem is of explaining how does the consciousness of macro physical entities such as human beings derive from the combination of the consciousness of micro physical entities. Analogously, cosmopsychists face the problem of explaining how does the consciousness, specifically the subjectivity, the ontic subjectivity of human beings, derive from the ontic subjectivity of the cosmos. And the problem in this is really that it seems to us intuitively that subjects are not the kind of things that can combine or split. To be a subject is to be the strongest breaches in nature, as William James called it. And his view has been quite influential in this discussion on the combination and decombination problem. Just to sort of articulate it, it seems that each subject is an ontological unity, is something that can be considered only as an individual, as a single entity, and is ontologically private. And when I say ontologically private, it seems that a subject's experience can be experienced only by itself, and the token experiential content cannot be shared with another subject. One is then faced with the following question: how is it possible for the qualitative content, say SC, to be experienced by various other subjects when all these subjects, the cosmic subject and the subjects that derive from it, like human subjects or animal subjects, are all ontologically private? This has been most rigorously articulated by Greg Miller in 2018. So this is really the decombination problem facing contemporary analytic cosmopsychism, that it seems like subjects in their ontic being are ontic unities and are ontologically private in the sense that their content cannot be shared with any other subject. If this is the case, how is it even possible? And this really pertains to the modal coherence question of the decombination and combination problem that Anand spoke about. How is it even possible for human subjects to derive from the cosmic subject? And if this explanatory gap still persists, at least in the context of contemporary philosophy of mind, it seems that panpsychism and cosmopsychism fares no better than orthodox physicalism, because it's faced with its own explanatory gap between the macro, cosmic and the other consciousness. So in response to this, broadly, there have been two kinds of cosmopsychist ontologies that have emerged. One is the priority cosmopsychist views, wherein proponents hold that while the cosmic consciousness, the cosmic subject is prior, the other subjects are also real individuals grounded or in some sense somehow derived as individuals from the cosmic consciousness. And this is really the more popular view. Some popular proponents include Philip Goff, Ite Shani, and Nagasaba and Wager. A less popular view is existence cosmopsychism, which is really the cosmopsychist version of existence monism, which is to say there is only one individual at all, that is the whole cosmos. And what we think of as further individuals, that is human subjects, are not really individuals at all that exists are one individual that is the cosmos as a whole. And I don't really think there has been a well fleshed out version of this view in contemporary philosophy of mind. And part of my purpose is to sort of reinterpret and position Vasishtha Advaita as a form of existence cosmopsychism. All right, moving on to Vasishtha Advaita. Vasishtha Advaita, like the other Vedantic school, proposed that Brahman, the essence of which is consciousness, we'll really get to what that means, is the only fundamental entity, and the plurality of entities are real qualities of the single substance. More specific, they characterize Brahman in various ways, and some of the relevant features is that Brahman is the Antarayaman, or the internal controller of all of reality. It is Sarvishesha, that is, it is endowed with all possible or all qualities are ultimately qualities of the single entity Brahman. It's important to contrast this with Advaita, who says that it's Nirvishesha or Nirguna. It is absolutely qualityless. It is also Ubhaya Linga, or it has dual characteristics. The dual characteristics being completely devoid of any negative attributes such as desire or suffering, while having all positive and auspicious characteristics. And it's also considered by the Vasishtha Advaitans as the union of two divine persons, Narayana and his divine consort Shri. And this really forms the basis of Ramanuja's Sri Vaishnava theology. Further, Vasishtha Advaitans also characterize the universe, all entities in the universe, as aṁśa of Brahman. Aṁśa is often translated as a part, but the whole point of the rest of the presentation is going to be understand what really aṁśa is. And the other schools of Vedanta, both Advaita and Madhva and the Bhaskaras as well, talk of jivas or entities as aṁśa of Brahman, but they really differ in what they mean by aṁśa, right? And the way that the Vasishtha Advaitans do this is to say that, hey, in the scriptures, specifically the Upanishads, there are passages which says that the universe and Brahman are similar or identical. On the other hand, there are also passages which say that they are distinct. How do they reconcile the two? And to do that, Ramanuja and Venkatananda employ this idea of aṁśa and reinterpret portions of the Brahma Sutras or the Vedanta Sutras, which is another foundational text, to show how both of the two can be reconciled. So in some sense, for the Vasishtha Advaitans, the universe is distinct yet inseparable from the universe. And how they do it is really the point of the rest of the presentation. However, the specific challenge that they face occurs on account of trying to reconcile two things. On the one hand, it is both distinct and inseparable. That is, human selves are distinct yet inseparable from the cosmic self of Brahman. And more importantly, if they are inseparable, how is it even possible that the negative attributes of human selves, such as our negative experience, such as suffering, our negative karma, how is it that they are not attributable to Brahman? Because as we just said, Vasishtha Advaitans also characterize Brahman as Ubhayalinga, that is one characteristic of which is to be devoid of all negative characteristics. So this seems to be a problem. How do they reconcile the inseparability with the fact that the individual cells are in some sense monadic, as in their negative experiences and attributes do not pass on to Brahman? So this is really the version of the one many problem that the Vasishtha Advaitans face. So here's Ramanuja, who says that, okay, there's another sort of problem. Some opponents of Vasishtha Advaita raise the question of, if all individual cells, human cells, are ultimately attributes of the single self, Brahman, why is it not the case that each of us don't experience each other's experiences? Ultimately, if the most fundamental subject is one, why is it the case that your experiences are not experienced by me and vice versa? And Ramanuja rejects this. And this is again that, to address these concerns, Ramanuja and Venkatananda describe or characterize the individual self as anu, which is sometimes translated as atomic or monadic. So this further aggravates the problem. How can a monadic self, right, which does not pass on its negative attributes to Brahman, how can it also be inseparable? Or rather, what is the metaphysics of relations between Brahman and Jiva, which allows the Vasishtha Advaitins to reconcile inseparability with monadicity, right? So before I move on to the specific Vasishtha Advaita metaphysics of relations, I want to sort of draw a distinction, really conceptual distinction between three kinds of subjectivity or subjects. First, one can refer to a subject simply as something that experiences qualities. This is the bare minimum a subject has to be. Subject considered as an ontological entity, not merely as a phenomenological entity, irrespective of the kind of content it experiences, a subject qua subject. Let us refer to this conception as subject one, right? While it the conception of subject one is really only to draw a conceptual distinction between subjects. It's a further question if a subject one is something that could exist by itself, is a bare subject that does not experience any quality at all, even possible. I'm not committed to any response to that, but I want to use the term subject one to refer to that bare subjectivity. Second, consider the kind of subjects that human beings typically are. Typically, humans have complex qualitative content spread across modalities. The unified qualitative content also has a subject-object structure, at least in most of our experiences, right? So let us refer to such subjects which have an subject-object phenomenology as subject threes, right? That's what I call. And in between subject one and subject two, we can at least in principle think of subject ones which experience qualities, but those qualities or the phenomenology do not have a subject-object structure. Now, again, is such kind of experience possible? Is a further question, but at least there seems to be some instances of people reporting such kind of non-dual experiences of experiences which do not have a subject-object structure at all. So I just wanted to outline this distinction here. I shall refer back to this a little later. We now move on to the, how much time? Okay. So the Vasishtha Advaita ontology includes of categories, and relations. A relation is not one of the metaphysical categories that they employ. However, they still hold that relations are real, right? As opposed to the Advaitins. On the other hand, as opposed to the Nayayikas, they do not think of relation as something that is separate from the relator. Rather, they think every relator has in itself, as part of its intrinsic nature, the propensity to be related. For example, the intrinsic nature of a substrate is to be related to an attribute, and the intrinsic nature of an attribute includes its propensity to be related to the substance, right? So based on this, they also reconceptualize, specifically Venkatanada reconceptualizes an attribute, not as merely an attribute, but as a Vishesha. That is, a Visheshana is an attribute that in turn and in some circumstances can also serve as the substrate, right? So while there is a pure substrate, that can only be a substrate, in their case, Brahman, there are other attributes or Visheshana as opposed to Guna, which can serve as attributes of Brahman and in turn serve as the substrate for other Visheshanas. On the other extreme, there are also some attributes which can only be attributes and which cannot serve as substrates. Those are gunas. So this concept of Visheshana is really central to how they respond to the one many problem. I'll skip a bit of this. Right? So now the question really is, since we saw that subject ones or pure subjectivity are the only ones that attribute individuality. For example, subject threes are individuals only because they are also subject ones. It's really the pure subjectivity that attributes individuality to subjects, or what we earlier called ontic unity and ontic privacy. So the question really is, how is a subject 3 that I am right now, including the experiences that I have, related to the Brahman? And how is the subject oneness of the subject 3 that I am related to Brahman currently? Right? And the answer that I propose is that what we think of a subject 1 that I am, that is the pure subjectivity of the individual human or jiva, is actually just the Brahman. And Brahman is the only individual that there is, or the only subject 1 that is. And my unified phenomenology, right, is an inseparable attribute, a visheshana, not of an individual subject 1e, because such subject ones don't exist at all, but of the only subject 1, that is Brahman, right? And the non-sentient entities of the universe too are similarly qualities structured in a manner where they appear to human jiva as matter. In short, to be an aṁśa of Brahman is to be the qualities experienced by the only subject 1, that is Brahman, qualities that are inseparable from Brahman, which along with it makes up the only concrete individual that there is, and hence existence cosmopsychism. Yet they are not identical to Brahman, for the two are distinct categories with distinct swarupa or intrinsic nature. The intrinsic nature of the Visheshana or the attributes is to be related, includes its propensity to be related to Brahman, while the intrinsic nature of Brahman includes the propensity to be related to the other attributes. And for these reasons, Vasishtha Advaitins think of them as distinct categories, yet at the same time inseparable. I shall skip these. It's also useful to sort of contrast the Vasishtha Advaitic view with the Bheda Abheda, specifically of Bhaskara, who have a very similar view. They describe jivas or the individual cells as limitations of the only entity, Brahman. So Venkatanada distinguishes their view from the Veda by the view by saying that individual cells are not mere limitations, because limitations do not explain, really capture the level of distinctness that's required. Rather, they need to be of a distinct category called a Visheshana, the intrinsic nature of which is to be related to Brahman. And that's what really makes it distinct, at the same time inseparable. I shall skip these. So ultimately, the picture that emerges is as follows. According to the Vasishtha Advaitic existence cosmopsychism that I've outlined here, reality consists of one individual Brahman, or the cosmos considered as a whole, that is a subject 1. Brahman has various inseparable attributes or Visheshana, some of which are structured in the form of sentient entities and others as non-sentient entities. Some of the sentient entities form qualitative clusters that are phenomenological unities, but not really ontological unities, which we call human cells or maybe other animal cells. The phenomenological monad are quasi-individuals by virtue of being Visheshanas, but not full individuals. This allows them to be the bearers of negative attributes and karma, which they do not pass on to Brahman. The quasi-individuality that a jiva has by virtue of being a Visheshana is what allows them this kind of monadicity, at least phenomenological monadicity, which is sufficient for them not to pass on their negative characteristics to Brahman. And I hope to have shown that this view can address the many problems faced both by the Vasishtha Advaitins and contemporary cosmopsychists by virtue of doing away with the subject combination problem by saying that there is really only one subject 1 and one ontological unity, that is Brahman as a whole. Maybe I'll clarify some of these other questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Siddharth. We're going to have if we carry on till 10 past, we'll have a 5-minute break. If you could get your coffees and come back to your seats, and then we'll carry on at quarter past. So then we'll be back on track. So questions.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of wondering how you retain the realism and embrace of subjects and so in the tradition along with your accounting.
By realism, you mean the realism of?
Realism of individual things.
Yeah, so real individual things are all real. They are just not real and distinct individuals. They are all real as attributes of the only entity that is Brahman. So yes, in that sense, they would not be real, ultimately real individuals, but they are nevertheless real. And the realism here is to some extent in relation to Advaita, which would ultimately say they are all illusory. They are not even real. But at least as attributes for the Shuddha Advaita, the universe of sentient and insentient are as real as Brahman. Just that they are real in a different way as attributes as opposed to pure substrate.
You have something.
Thank you, first of all, for your presentation. Clarification question. On your view, I know that Vishishta is a theistic tradition. On your view, are these attributes eternally attributes? And if they are, how are they not individual on their own?
Yeah, so that's sort of part of the question I couldn't get into. So every Visheshana, even at the state of creation or at the state of dissolution or mukti, are still distinct Visheshana of Brahman. So in some sense, you can think of Visheshana as a locus of change, which at the state of creation is not really a phenomenological monad, but with karma sort of becomes what we call a jiva, which is still distinct from Brahman as a Visheshana. And that's why I call it a quasi-individual, but it's still not a full individual because it can exist only in relation to Brahman and only as an attribute, an inseparable attribute of Brahman. And the same with Mukti, even after Mukti or dissolution, the Visheshana still exists, but just not as a jiva. In some sense, you can think of it as a permanent location in the qualitative space of Brahman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm just thinking of Spinoza now all the time. Do you see also those relation between the position you defended in your talk and Spinoza's, well, pantheism, panentheism, because on his account, like a finite entity is also somehow a mode, ultimately, of the one infinite substance. So did you think of this?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with Spinoza, though I wonder if Spinoza posits a cosmic consciousness. All entities are modes of the only entity, but is that only entity a subject having experience?
Well, yeah, it is mind and extended are the attributes. The two we know.
But I don't know. I don't think it's a cosmocytist view as much as it's a monist view with modes of sentience and non-sentience, right? I don't think that there is a cosmic consciousness as such in Spinoza. Is that? I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I don't debate book, I would say. Some say so, others no.
Substance known as an attribute dualism, isn't it? So if the
Yeah.
attribute is conscious, then I don't know if it's something. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting question. Well, I think I have perhaps two questions, but let me try to just list the first one. The cosmopsychist views that we are aware of, usually they take the whole cosmos, I mean, the whole of reality as consciousness, and they give different views on what that means. But according to your account of Brahman as a cosmopsychist view, right? All the entities, all the objects, they are attributes of this. It's God, right? So you correct me if I'm wrong. I suppose this makes some sense. So there is some kind of other entity, such that all entities that exist are attributes of this entity, which is God. So in this sense, there's a quite different notion of cosmos than the one traditional cosmopsychist views consider, right? So that's the first question. I don't know if you have something to say about that. And the second one, very quickly. Of course, we will hear that in like textbooks that speak about Brahma Nuja, that we are properties, and
And that's one way to understand the word aṁśa. But how to, I mean, from a commonsensical point of view, how to make sense of the claim that, for instance, like this chair is a property of something, because properties usually we think about something that qualifies, right? Like entities and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering if this is the right word, because we use the word properties in philosophy and in commonsensical like context in a quite different way. So can we still use the word property?
Yeah. Thank you. My response to your first question is really is, can this view be called cosmocycles? Because that seems to be something other than what we normally think of as the cosmos, here Brahman, right? So yeah, in one way, if you think of the cosmos as what is described as our best theories in physics as the cosmos, that is in this view merely an attribute of Brahman, but Brahman is all of reality together. So that's why I sort of define cosmos not as it would be defined by the physicists, but as all that exists. If Brahman exists, that's part of cosmos. So in that broad definition of cosmocytism, you can think of this view as cosmocytism. The second question is, how can what we think of as an everyday object such as a chair, let alone even our own human cells, be an attribute as opposed to be an object, right? So I think on this view, they are attributes because they are really qualities, by which I mean experiential qualities experienced by Brahman, which appears as a distinct object to jivas, right? So their objectivity is in some sense only part of our appearance, right? Ultimately, they are just phenomenal qualities structured in a particular way so as to appear as an object to a jiva. So their objecthood is in that sense purely in relation to the cognition of jivas and not in themselves. In themselves, they are merely attributes of Brahman, where to be an attribute is to be a quality of the subject one that is Brahman.
You were speaking about like, I'm sorry.
I think we have one more question from Anand, and then we'll have to stop.
He has to write. He has written his question. He said, I have a question, but
Can you hear
Anand,
me?
do you have a question to tell us?
Yeah, I do have a question. So my question is, so Siddharth, I thought one of the things that you didn't talk a lot about, which affects the way you think about Ramanuja's theory in terms of certain problems that he can have, is, at least under my understanding, is that the relationship between Brahman and the attributes, specifically us, for example, is that the relationship is specifically one of enlivening or emanation. So that the relationship is a specific kind of relationship whereby things become properties, because if they have an emanation aspect to them, which I think under Ramanuja's view, they all have an emanation aspect to them, they're getting their emanation and enlivening from Brahman. And I think that aspect of your theory is kind of left out. So my first part would be, what does that play in your thing? And then the second one is the obvious question I asked you the other day, which I think is helpful to people to understand, is that if Visheshana is both a substance or a substrate in some sense and an attribute, then what makes it the case that we qualify it as the attribute as opposed to the substrate? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Can I just think from here? Thank you, Anand, for both these questions. I agree that I did not really get into enlivening in all its aspects. For example, enlivening, if to say that jivas and the other sentient entities are in some sense derive that enlivenment from the Brahman would include them deriving their subjectivity, ontic subjectivity, as well as their agentiality from Brahman. Here, really, I was only focusing on the first one of how do they derive or their subjectivity or even the capacity to have experiences from Brahman. So I only really focused on that aspect. I don't know enough, honestly, to say to comment on the second part of how do jivas derive their agentiality from Brahman. And second, it is, I mean, when we say that human cells or jivas are Visheshana of Brahman, they can be both substrate and attribute. And in relation to the only pure substance, that is Brahman, they are attributes. They in fact act as substrates to what we think of as our everyday experiences. For example, right now, the self or the jiva that I am is an attribute of Brahman, but is also the substrate of the experiential quality of, say, blueness that I experience right now. So it is true that jivas are also substrates, but they are also attributes of Brahman. I hope this answers your question.
Well, thank you so much. That was terrific. Thank you. So we'll have to go now. Thank you. I suggest